y directora de programas y estrategia aquí in HIP. My name is Amalia. I'm Director of Programs and Strategy with HIP. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us this afternoon for what I think is a really important conversation on the crisis of Venezuelans leaving our country, my country, today. It's never in the history of Venezuela have we seen such a flow of Venezuelans leaving. I came here when I was 6 years old, and nobody else in my family left Venezuela. And up until these last couple of years, where so many people are being forced through a reality of not having access to food, to health care, to jobs, to very simple supplies like gas. My cousin 3 weeks ago had to make food for my 91-year-old grandmother and her 16-year-old son over a wood fire because she could not get gas. And this is after my mom and my family are trying to send resources. And beyond that, there's political instability, there's violence, there's you've heard the stories about the hospitals. And so we are seeing an incredible crisis of millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country. Venezuelans have lost an average of 24 pounds in the last 4 years, and people are being faced with the reality of leaving every single day. My grandfather, who died a few years ago, always, when we'd have a delicious meal or an amazing dessert, would say, "Y no te acostumbres, don't get used to it." And I think that's what we did as Venezuelans. We got used to a country full of amazing resources, from rainforests and beaches and just a richness of culture and life and a strong middle class. And I think what we're facing as Venezuelans, as people who have loved Venezuela, is that we got used to it, and now people are trying to understand, where do you go, how do you rebuild? And without a network and generations of Venezuelans who have fled and left and developed communities in other places, we're left to understand, how do we rebuild? How do we support these communities? How do we allow for the communities that have been incorporating so many Venezuelans in need to be able to do that at the capacity that they need to, without the strains that we're seeing currently in so many countries where already they're seeing much need in their own communities. And so I'm really, really excited to have today such an incredible group of experts and allies and advocates here today. And so I'm going to pass it over to Caroline, who's going to be moderating today. Caroline comes from the Tinker Foundation, president, and also a great friend for us at HIP to be able to do this work together. So thank you.
No, thank you, Amalia, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And before I introduce our panel, I just wanted to share very briefly about why Tinker teamed up with Hispanics in Philanthropy on this event. At the Tinker Foundation, we support civil society organizations in Latin America working on the issues that matter most to the region, like governance, education, and the environment. And from our conversations with our partners in the region and our own time spent there, it's clear that the forced migration of Venezuelans from their country is becoming more and more of a serious regional challenge, with implications both for migrants and for the countries receiving them. And the numbers really are stunning. So according to the UNHCR, these are the newest numbers as of just a few days ago. There are now 3.9 million Venezuelans who have left their country in the last few years, including 500,000 in the last 3 months. 500,000 people is the population of Atlanta. So most Venezuelans are going to other Latin American countries, which is a really important piece of context for this conversation, principally Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. But it is truly a regional phenomenon. And globally, it's the second biggest displacement crisis in the world after Syria. But we aren't hearing as much about it in the US and in the funding community as we might expect, and funding has been comparatively limited. So we are here today as funders and as allies to understand what role we can play to help protect the rights and ensure the well-being of Venezuelans on the move. And luckily, we have an amazing panel here with us to help us think this through together. So Beatriz Borges, right here, BB, is an attorney and the executive director of the Justice and Peace Center, CEPAS, a nonprofit organization that works to promote and defend democratic values, human rights, and a culture of peace in Venezuela. And in recent months, Beatriz has focused on advocating for the rights of Venezuelans both within and outside of Venezuela in international forums, including the UN Security Council. Patrick Gage is Director of Development at the Scalabrini International Migration Network, which is a nonprofit organization serving displaced people in 34 countries. Patrick's work focuses on support for Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Latin America, building on Scalabrini's long-term presence in the region. Next we have Jeff Ramsey, who's Assistant Director for Venezuela at WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. Jeff has played a really key role coordinating WOLA's response to and coverage of the economic, social, and political crisis in Venezuela, and he contributes to WOLA's excellent Venezuela blog, which I would recommend. And finally, Francisco Quintana, or who I might slip up and call Paco, is the Program Director for the Andean, North American, and Caribbean region at CEGIL, the Center for Justice and International Law based here in DC. And also as a human rights lawyer, Francisco has played a leadership role in bringing together civil society organizations really from all over the region to work together on the Venezuelan Human Mobility Initiative. And CEGIL also publishes a terrific weekly roundup of Spanish language news and resources about the Venezuelan forced displacement crisis. So thank you so much to all of you for being here, panelists. And I'll start by asking some questions of the panelists and really getting their expertise on the context of this situation. And then we'll welcome the audience to join the discussion. And one thing we'd really love to hear from you in that part of the session is what your experiences are as funders or as potentially interested funders on this topic. And one last note for our discussion. I really want to emphasize that our focus today is on migration and that specific dimension of the larger situation affecting Venezuela. So we'll likely touch on the political situation in Venezuela, but I'm going to pull us back if we get too far down that path, because we're really here today to think about how all of us can support that 3.9 million people that we just spoke about. And we'll also follow up on this panel with specific resources for people who are interested in having a bit more background information on the situation. So let's jump right in with our panel. And Jeff, I think I'll start with you. For funders who are newer to this situation, can you help explain why the number of people leaving Venezuela has increased so much since 2015? And maybe as part of answering that, you could talk a little bit about how the kind of profile of people leaving has changed over time as well.
Sure, thank you. So as Carolyn said, I'm Jeff Ramsey. I'm the Assistant Director for Venezuela at WOLA. At WOLA, we work not just on the displacement crisis in Venezuela, we also work on the political crisis domestically, as well as ensuring a robust humanitarian response to conditions within Venezuela. And I think as far as why the crisis has gotten so much worse, I think obviously Beatriz has much to say about this, but I think the truth is that Venezuela is in a crisis of governability. The root of the crisis is years of widespread corruption and mismanagement. And the simple fact is that the current government, or de facto government, I should say, in Venezuela simply doesn't possess the tools to turn the situation around. And I think that's what's fleeing this. That's what's causing so many to flee. As you mentioned, I was actually doing the math the other day. If the current pace of the displacement crisis continues, we can expect the number of Venezuelans abroad to surpass the number of Syrians by 2023. And so I think that really underscores the urgency of a more robust multilateral response to not only the displacement crisis, but also the political crisis within Venezuela's borders.
That's great. And can you speak a little bit to how the kind of profile of people is shifting who are leaving Venezuela, this year, last year, compared to a few years ago?
Sure. So, at WOLA, we've been monitoring the displacement crisis, particularly in the last 2 years. We carried out field work on the Colombia-Venezuela border, as well as the Brazil-Venezuela border in early last year. We're going back to the Brazil-Venezuela border in just a few weeks. And I think what's been really striking is the degree to which the profile of migrants and refugees has shifted from people that were originally middle class, middle upper class, to now, the poorest of the poor. I mean, these are people who, may have benefited from social programs that were in place up until recently, and are currently dealing with the consequences of a complete state collapse.
And Patrick, just to follow up on what Jeff's sharing, the Scalabrini mission works at the Colombian border and major cities throughout Latin America, really providing direct services to migrants like food and shelter and access to legal services. What are some of the specific needs that you're seeing in terms of the newest arrivals from Venezuela?
Yeah, so I mean, you could probably name anything, and I would nod my head. In terms of, so around we provide a holistic range of services, so all the way from free meals, of which we serve about 4,500 every day in Cúcuta, to about 2,000 people, all the way up to job training.
Cúcuta is on the border between Colombia and Venezuela,
right.
In Colombia, but we're in Venezuela.
And it's kind of like the ground zero for the crisis. I've heard people on the ground say they estimate 90% of Venezuelans coming into Colombia come through that city. In terms of the specific needs and some of, I think, the more pressing needs, there are a couple. First, I think shelter is a huge need. We are, and I've been told this on the ground, we are the only free shelter for Venezuelans in the city. This is a city of 700,000, 800,000 people, and we can house about 150 people a night, and that's including, we're a Catholic nonprofit, so we have a chapel in our center. That's including taking all the chairs out and putting mattresses on the floor, and pretty much filling up every possible space we can. And besides that, you essentially, at least the people who are staying in Cúcuta, most of the Venezuelans coming through, they're passing through and they don't actually stay on the border. But those who do, they're living in essentially, shacks, that they built themselves and are reminiscent of parts of Haiti and very underdeveloped countries. So I think shelter is a big need, and that demands infrastructure. I think in terms of maybe the most pressing need, there are the most pressing needs. There are two. Medical care is huge, particularly basic medical care, so preventive care, vaccinations, dialysis, HIV treatment, cancer, things like that. At the moment, and I think pretty much since the crisis began, Venezuelans, since most of them are undocumented, and even those who are documented, they're unable to access the Colombian health system except in emergencies. So if they're dying, or giving birth, they can go into a hospital, but otherwise they kind of need to fend for themselves. So that's a huge need as well. And then jobs, both on the border and in major cities. If you ask a group of people, which I've done, the first thing they'll say is jobs. Not only because they need to feed themselves, but a lot of them leave Venezuela on their own so they can send money home. So if they don't have a job, their journey is kind of pointless. So I think those shelter, basic medical care, and jobs are kind of the key needs at the moment.
Thanks, Patrick. And Vivi, you have a really valuable perspective to contribute here, both as a Venezuelan now living in the U.S., but also as an advocate and researcher and activist who's studying the situation of Venezuelans in the region. And I'd love to hear about sort of those two facets of the work that you do, and then maybe also you could tell us a little bit in particular about the situation of women among this migrant flow, who, as you've shown, have really specific and special vulnerability.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for allowing me to talk about my country. Venezuela has a crisis that everyone talks, but not everyone understands. And I think many talks about it because migrants and refugees, thank you for those testimonies that are show the tragedy that we are living in our country. And I would like to share a personal story to try to explain your question. I used to be teacher at the university, and my job there was a professor of the legal clinics, and we gave legal assistance to the migrants and refugees in Venezuela. Most of them were from Colombia, and it was like 9 years ago. And for me, Venezuela was a host country. Venezuela was a country who Venezuela didn't want to leave. And in the last 4-5 years, we became in a country, an origin country from the greatest crisis of human mobility in the region. And that's happened in front of everybody. From civil society, we start to alert the reason for this, because everybody think or thought the migration or the mobility, but a few people know about, understand what is happening there. And we're trying to alert from 2014. We have a complex humanitarian emergency, but that emergency is caused by a combination of political decisions. But the consequence is the systematic violation of human rights. And one of the consequences is the massive human mobility crisis. And this is affecting everybody. Everyone is affected by that emergency. Just let me give you some examples. The average minimum salary monthly is between $5 and $8, and one bag of milk is $10. You cannot buy that. I used to, my monthly salary at the university was $2 monthly. And when I go to the food court, I couldn't buy a sandwich in Subway. The poorest people is more affected, of course. And for example, with the Caritas program, the children's, the desnutrition are in 54%. And you imagine 6 from 10 children who are given help for Caritas, they are in malnutrition conditions, and 30% of them are in a severe malnutrition. That is not affecting just them like children, it's affecting the future of Venezuela, because they are growing with cognitive problems. Even with the other vulnerable groups like women or elders are affected in a different way. And that's why it's clear that the majority of the Venezuelans and the millions who are left the country need international protection. Even for the humanitarian situation, we are threats, we are in risk in our freedom, in our liberty. Go back to Venezuelans could mean that they took off your passport or they put you in jail because you say or because you are fighting for our rights. That's important to understand, and understand also that our situation is complex and you cannot find a simple answer for that. That's why it's important understand what is happening there, the complexity, and that is affecting the entire population in Venezuela.
Thank you, Vivi. And Francisco, I'm hoping that you can tell us a bit more about the work that you're doing. So even as we describe this displacement crisis, there are dozens of civil society organizations and individuals coming together in the countries in Latin America receiving Venezuelans to try to be part of a productive response and to try to address not just short-term humanitarian needs, but also find longer-term solutions, given that, as Jeff says, this is a situation that could only grow in magnitude. So, Francisco, tell us a little bit about the network of civil society organizations that you've brought together and the work that you're doing, and maybe also a little bit about the challenges that those organizations are facing as they're trying to protect the rights of Venezuelans.
Yes, thank you very much. So as you can see on the screen, and some of you already have it on the table, the Center for Justice and International Law, CIGIL, has led a response from civil society for the last 18 months. And it is really important to stress this because the platform from the UNHCR and the IOM was just established 6 months ago in December. So civil society reacted from the very beginning for this crisis because civil society is the one who receives the population. Civil society is the one who brings shelter, as Patrick just said, legal services and support. And one of our goals as a group is to bring the human rights perspective to this crisis. Let me just tell you also one story. 1 month ago, we were in Colombia talking to the Venezuelan diaspora, and one girl, Marjorie, just told us her story. She's 25 years old. When she arrived to the bus station in Colombia, she was asked to prostitute herself in order to get food or shelter. She was able to get to a city where she got a job, but she was discriminated at her workplace. Then she stayed with a family of Colombians, but there were xenophobic reactions within the family. Fortunately, well, not fortunately, sorry. Then she moved, got a couple, and she was beaten by this couple, and she had to flee also that home. And her story continues. She finally gets a document by the Colombian government, the temporal permit, and the Colombian government says, well, we are already helping migrants. But with that document, she cannot access to health. Not all the government organizations or not all the individual enterprises, the private companies, recognize that document. So her situation is not solved still. And we in all this story, you can never find the government taking the human rights approach. She was discriminated. There was gender violence. There was xenophobic reactions. She needed access to justice, but people are not recognizing this. And as the story of Marjorie was just told, we can find the stories with indigenous peoples, with children, with persons with disability, elderly people. And this is the kind of response that you can find in this plan of action. So yeah, we have a lot of challenges, and one of our drivers is that this crisis is so big that we cannot, we don't have the luxury to waste time and to repeat the actions that we are doing. So by coordinating a regional response, we are trying to bring the information from one country to the other, identify the good practices, and also do joint advocacy to change the structural situations within the country to have a more robust legal framework in order to attend this crisis. If you can see the members of the group, we are focusing on diversity. One of the experiences from previous crises in Latin America is that only members from the migration community try to respond in Central America or in Mexico. What we tried to do in this time was to bring many actors to the table. So you can see humanitarian aid organizations, development, academia, and human rights organizations. And if you read the plan of action that we were able to put together, you will find all those contributions in this document. The challenges, we have to create the impact within the communities, the changes within the countries, in order to give permanent solutions, not temporary solutions to this crisis.
Thank you, Francisco. And I have just a few more questions for the panel that are focused on questions that you as funders might have and on the funding situation, and then we'll open it up more to the full group to be able to discuss. So for anyone on the panel, I want to start with a question about what role the people in this room can play. We know that there's not nearly enough international assistance flowing to this issue, and it's unfortunately rather unlikely that private philanthropy will close the gap. So what is a strategic role, or what are different strategic roles that funders of the type that are here could play in helping to support the response to the situation, both in the near term and also in the long term? Anyone want to go first?
Sure. I think the key word here is advocacy. I think that I think funding is absolutely needed for the urgent humanitarian response to the immediate needs of those fleeing Venezuela. But I think the truth is that the political crisis in Venezuela is not going to be resolved tomorrow. Even if Maduro were to leave tomorrow, it's likely the displacement crisis would continue, and the estimates of 5 million Venezuelans leaving the country or having left the country by the end of the year will still hold. And so I think where that leads us is to the importance of, as Paco mentioned, the importance of Pan-American advocacy networks. I think that there needs to be more coordination between northern and southern organizations on this issue because both have access to the roots of the problem, right? I think host countries like to talk about the importance of funding. If there's one thing that governments can agree on, it's that they need more money. We saw it just today, the Lima Group countries, that has been this coalition responding to the Venezuelan crisis around the hemisphere. One of the points of consensus in their declaration that they issued today was the need for more funding, with no mention of the obligations of these states in terms of broadening access to regular status, access to essential services. And so I think that the conversation can't just be about funding. Funding is important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I think there needs to be more advocacy in donor countries. The U.S. government, interesting tidbit here. The U.S. government in 2018 spent 4 times as much on the response to the displacement crisis in Myanmar compared to the displacement crisis in Venezuela, even as the number of displaced Venezuelans is 3 times higher. So they spent 4 times as much on Myanmar when the number of displaced Venezuelans is 3 times higher. However, funding alone is not enough. I think, as I said, there needs to be more commitments from the states that are accepting fleeing Venezuelans, and I think the key to all of this is these cross-border advocacy networks. I think are going to be really important in moving the ball.
Well, as I say, the situation is complex, and there's no one way to do it. And some way that I find to explain is that we need a combined response. One who see the humanitarian situation inside the country, but also outside the country with the crisis of human mobility, but also who see or who is in charge of the political situation and the human rights situation in the same time, because both are urgent. The first, maybe the times are right now, but the political situation is something that is going to take time, as Joe said, but we have to try to resolve since now. We don't have to wait to Maduro left the country to start to build it, because the country is in a breakdown and collapse, and the situation gets dramatically worse. And the way that I think is clue to help the situation is support civil society. All the numbers that you hear about Venezuela, you have and you know, because civil society was documented all what's happening there, because we don't have any official numbers. And many organizations in Venezuela and outside Venezuela are having humanitarian programs to helping Venezuelans to survive. That's why I think the support for civil society could be the most important in this moment, because we are dealing with the crisis, we are trying to support life, and also we are documenting all that is happening in Venezuela, that we don't have justice, we don't have any organization independent, but we have the information, but in the future we can ask for justice.
Yeah, I want to add something to what Vivi just said. It is really important to identify the different actors. This is a very complex situation, and governments were not prepared to solve these issues. Colombia was a country that expelled population, so they didn't have the institutional capacity to receive population, and we see that in the government offices. They don't know how to handle all these situations, and the governments are investing, but there are more things that need to be done. And please pay a lot of attention to what civil society is doing, because I have seen international organizations or even governments talking about the accomplishments that they have done, but it's reality, it's civil society who is doing the job. So one of the advice that we talked during the preparation of this panel is try to identify civil society in the local level to strengthen them, because they are the ones that will stay, hopefully, when this crisis passes in the next months or a couple of years. And some international organizations, they will leave. And there is a big lesson from the Americas to be learned. We have been dealing with migration crisis for the last 30 years. The Cartagena Declaration that everybody talks about was created in 1989 with a crisis from Central America. We have created plans of action, the Plan of Action of Mexico, the Plan of Action of Brazil, and UNHCR bragged about Latin America coordination with civil society in their response for the last 10 years. But see where we are now. We are not able to respond as fully as we should be doing with all these legal frameworks and coordination. There is a need for more investment in civil society on the local level. Just as an example, in Peru, there were 6 organizations. Today, there are 50 organizations at the table. So the question is, who are they? And what is happening to these organizations that were always on the ground that are helping the migration? So just follow closely who the actors are.
Great, and thank you. And I think that theme that in many ways all of you touched on about the importance of supporting local civil society response is something that Amalia will talk a little bit more about in terms of how HIP is thinking about equipping funders interested in funding on this issue with tools to be able to do exactly that. I'll ask one more question of the panel and then I'll open it up to the full group. Earlier this morning, those of us at the HIP conference heard from the Costa Rican first Vice President, Epsi Campbell-Barr, in a really moving speech where she shared with us that, while on the one hand we should recognize the disruption and challenge of migration when people are leaving home that don't want to, on the other hand we should recognize that migration enriches countries that receive those migrants and can be part of a story of development and well-being for those countries, and that's true in many of the stories of our own family as she was talking about in her own case. So I'd love to hear from any of you who have thoughts about the role that funding can play in supporting the resilience of the countries who are receiving Venezuelans in such large numbers, and also ideas for how we can support Venezuelans to more quickly get to a point that they're contributing as well in the new places they're calling home.
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes back to one of the needs that I talked about, which is helping the Colombian government, Peruvian government create jobs for these people. It's a different situation in Bogota or Lima, which are bigger cities and certainly struggling in their own right. But when you go to a city like Cucuta, I think their informal rate of employment is like 60 or 70%, which means the vast majority of people in the city who are working are not actually working in the formal economy. They're either working in the non-illicit informal economy, or they're smuggling, or things like that. So that makes it a lot more difficult for those communities to welcome people. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, data from the Colombian government said that of the people who got RAMV status, which is kind of like another form of temporary status, and they had a window about a year ago, only 1% of the Venezuelans who reported working in a formal job. And that is, and the economics are there. So if you look into it, in Cucuta, for example, and then further south, there's another city called Arauca. These areas used to be strongholds of FARC and some of them are still strongholds of the ELN, a number of militias. And if you're a Venezuelan and you sign up to work for the ELN or FARC dissidents, you can earn as much as $300 a month, whereas even the normal Colombian wage is about the same, and that's for people who are documented and have know the culture and have the right connections and everything. So in terms of what funders can do is I think really focus on those programs. That's what's going to make communities resilient. That's what's going to help the host communities as well. And when you do those programs, so when we do our job training programs, you have to be open-minded about what you're training people to do. So it's not always going to be like really cool tech jobs. In fact, it's like never that. We're training people to fix motorcycles and cars, which is a huge need in Cucuta. Everybody drives a motorcycle, and things like that. And you also, I think, need to be receptive to the host community, that those people need to benefit from it too. So when we do our training programs and help people find jobs, we're bringing in local Colombians as well. It's a mix of those people. So as funders, I think you want to support programs that focus, obviously humanitarian aid is important to us, but longer term things too, because that helps the community, and then certainly put an emphasis on it. Whenever you're thinking of funding somebody or having that conversation, make sure that they're involving people in the host community as well. Otherwise, you're just kind of creating an us versus them scenario that makes everybody worse off.
Yeah, well, talking about my country is painful, but also we try to act in terms of bringing some hope. I would like to share some pictures that we share about an example that what we are doing about build the future. The human mobility crisis is a reality for us right now, and the experience have show us that most of them are living right now, they are not come back, but we are called to build a nation from outside our country. And this is an example that something that we are doing right now to try to do that. We are new as migrants and refugees. As I said, we used to be a host country, and we are learning how to be that community outside our country. And this is something that we have to learn, because for us it's new. Venezuela didn't leave the country, and the first step is to know our rights as migrants and refugees, not being treated like victims or just a third person. We want to be the protagonists of our decision that the governments are taking about us. This is the first thing. And in that meeting, we have a dialogue. Also, we discussed the plan, the civil society plan there. The first one was last week in New York, talking about the TPS and talking about what are the challenges in the now is in Argentina, also in Spain. Today is in Chile. We are talking about what happened with us, what we can do for Venezuela, outside of Venezuela, but also what we can do about our rights outside of Venezuela, and what are the political decisions that many governments are taking about our country. And also something that we are see about what is happening is that we have in a period of duelo, mourning, that is affecting most of Venezuelans, because we are sad about what is happening right now, and that feeling stop us to acting. And this is something we have to overcome, and we have to transform in an action. And this is even for my colleagues in Venezuela, we don't know how to handle this big tragedy, because everything is a problem in Venezuela. Just to do an event, as you said, everything is happening at the same time. It's very difficult to deal with that. This is the most important resilient challenge that we have to face. But support Venezuelans is something that in the future could be the solution for the country. We are working right now for the next generations.
Thank you, Bibi. So I'd love to open it up to the group that's been listening so far. And actually, I'm sure many of you have more general questions, but I'd love to just start by hearing from either funders who are currently funding on this issue and what you're seeing and learning and doing, or if you're a funder who's interested on this issue but haven't yet taken action, what more are you interested in learning and understanding? So does anyone want to speak from either one of those two perspectives?
I will.
Yeah.
Kind of from both, maybe.
Okay,
Just
great.
to confuse things. My name is Ginger Deason. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm the foundation representative for Ecuador and Panama from the Inter-American Foundation. And those who don't know us, we're a tiny federal agency, and we support grassroots development projects all over Latin America. We've just started a Venezuelan initiative, and our focus, I'm really glad to hear what the panel is saying, because I think we're going to go in the right direction. We're hoping to. Our focus is social and economic inclusion. And so we have, in Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. We are going to, hopefully, by the end of this year, by the end of this fiscal year, hopefully, we'll have our first funding out to about 10 organizations that are community-based organizations in these countries that are working with Venezuelan migrants in job creation, in social inclusion, so that there's not so many horrible instances of reactions of xenophobia in all the host communities, and with the social and economic inclusion, of course, that involves, well, hopefully not of course, psychosocial support and different ways of including Venezuelans in what the community-based organizations are doing. And so I wanted to, the first category was people who aren't funding. So we're not quite yet funding, but we're getting there. And the second part was if we had questions, and I'm really interested to find out what kind of strategies other funders are using, just in general, and then for monitoring and evaluation, because we want to start thinking about that right now when we're starting, so that we can do a good job, hopefully. And I wanted to give a shout out to Misión Escalabriniana. I was in Ibarra in northern Ecuador 2 weeks ago, and there is a Misión there, an office, I don't know what you call it, and we met with them, and they are just, pardon my French, but they're kicking ass and taking names. I mean, they are doing amazing work in job training and development for Venezuelans and Colombians and Ecuadorians, so it's great. But yeah, so thank you, and I'd like to have answers.
Who has an answer for Ginger?
I can talk from HIP's perspective. We've been talking and reaching out to a lot of funders, and a lot of funders that have been coming to us in terms of that same question, is trying to understand what are other funders doing and how are they approaching what starting to feel like an overwhelming crisis in many places. And I think that there's a division in what I've observed in funders, and Caroline, you can also provide input based on what you've seen, as well as Jeff and Banco and others. There's a division, I think, in approach where some funders are really looking at, are coming to the region. They've been funding Syrian refugees, they've been funding, I think we mentioned folks from Myanmar, and now seeing that this crisis in our region is just as urgent, is just as dire as what we've been seeing across seas, and looking at the Venezuelan migrant crisis within our region as the next long, protracted refugee crisis. And so thinking about it on a humanitarian lens, and what local organizations are facing is also an influx of larger humanitarian organizations that are coming in with, the infrastructure, the dollars, et cetera, to put their work into place and overshadow the work of local organizations that have been responding to Colombian refugees, for example, or others, and are there to really build local civil society. And so that takes me to the second point, where there are other funders that are starting to begin to ask that question, or have been digging in, like Open Society Foundation, on society building, civil society building, particularly looking at the diaspora and seeing how the diaspora can, from the outside of Venezuela, build political power for Venezuelans, begin to take action on issues of social justice and access to justice within those countries. And maybe I'll turn it over to Paco or Jeff if you guys want to comment on that.
Well, yeah, I would, just to add to those comments on the question before, like how to help governments and how to contribute to the solutions. I wanted to highlight some points. When civil society is trying to focus on long-term solutions, this is in order to get to the root consequences of migration in the region. So one of the problems that we have seen is that we are talking too much about Venezuelan migration when there is also Nicaraguan migration, Cuban migration, Haitian migration. So just to give an example how we can contribute with governments, we have to change the narrative. The narrative is there is a crisis, so governments say there is a solution. We have 5 migrants, we have 5 permits of stay. We need jobs, we create 5 jobs. But we need to change the narrative. This is a migration complex situation that needs a variety of responses. And one of those responses is also done through campaigns. So in Colombia, there was a campaign called Somos Panas, trying to integrate with children, also commercial with children. In Peru, there is a campaign, Soy mi causa es tu causa, trying to combat xenophobia. And just this week, there is a very interesting campaign from the Jesuits in Chile. There was a soccer match between Chile and Haiti, and there's a lot of discrimination of Haitian population in Chile. So there was a campaign. So through all these campaigns, so there are a variety of forms that we can help governments and we can help the communities to move to this. I mentioned before that governments were not prepared to receive the population. So that is step number 1. Step number 3, 4, or 5 is integration. So we have to move very quickly from the first responses to the integration. That's what we try to do in chapters 4 and 5. And for anybody here at the table, it would be a good test for our work that we did in the plan of action to see if whatever we suggested in this plan of action helps you to do the monitoring. That's what we are trying to do. And we had conversations with the presidency of Colombia, and they did mention, I don't know if they will do it, but they did mention that they will use the plan of action in order to compare and evaluate what they are doing, where we have coincidences and where we have disagreements, and then keep the conversation going.
I think what's been interesting to see is increasingly we've seen funders really start to see this dynamic that Paco mentioned, that the response to the political crisis in Venezuela, within Venezuela's borders, has to a degree spilled over into the way that the displacement crisis is being framed, and that's true especially in Washington, where my favorite example is the Chilean case. Last year, or in early 2018, Chile rolled out what they call the Democratic Responsibility Visa, which sounds great, but actually deeply restricts access to regular status. It makes it much harder for Venezuelans to migrate legally to Chile because they have to have a valid passport, they have to get everything apostilled, they have to present it at the consulate in Caracas before being able to migrate legally. So I think there's increasing interest in decoupling the response to the political crisis from the response to the needs of fleeing Venezuelans, and that's been really encouraging to see. I think I'm hopeful that governments across the region will increasingly move in that direction as well. I think we saw some movement towards the latter half of last year around this single set of commitments from regional countries towards sort of a basic set of minimum standards. Since then, though, I think states have been giving themselves a lot of leeway, and there's kind of been some backsliding. So I think it really highlights the need for advocacy. I think governments are going to have to be pushed into this.
Great. Any other comments or questions from funders specifically who are interested in considering this issue for their own funding? And if not,
And we have three funders on the phone, I think. I'm not sure if they can send a chat, but we might be getting comments from them over time.
okay. So jump in if we get any questions via chat. So why don't we then open it up to a broader Q&A for our panel about this issue and questions you might have for them.
Hello, my name is Freddie. Going off of Ms. Patrice's comments on helping Venezuela inside and outside of Venezuela with the TPS, and considering the humanitarian crisis and that every one of 5 asylum petitions in the United States are from Venezuelans, why do you think Washington has still not approved the TPS and made it a top priority? And what type of funding or work do you think is necessary for grassroots movements for it to be approved?
I'm so glad you asked that question. That was one of my backups. So we have a lot of funders here at the conference who are focused on immigration issues here in the U.S. So thoughts on what the U.S. government should be doing and what an effective advocacy strategy might be here in the U.S.? Jeff, I know you have thoughts on this.
Yes.
Or do you?
Well, it's something that I can say because, as you say, last week we was talking about that, is that even Venezuela are dealing with the status right now. Many of Venezuelans that came to the United States are asylum seekers, but the percentage of the positive answers are like a 50%, are so low. But in the same time, we are seeing the benefit of, in comparison with the asylum figure and the TPS, and something that we thought that is important in this moment to have both, because many of Venezuelan doesn't have the requirements to qualify to an asylum. And that's why the TPS is a very good, is an alternative for Venezuelans who cannot go back to Venezuela right now. Something that was the result of that meeting was how we can organize to do this advocacy and to ask all the representatives for this possibility for Venezuela. And it's the same that we are talking. Many governments are being supporting the political situation, but they are not commitment with the Venezuelans in their countries. And that's something why we are, as a citizen, as a person who knows the rights, organize and be a community and ask for doing this advocacy for us, for our rights. And that's important to be in contact and to build a community that together can ask for it.
Well, the question was what can the United States do in order to move this issue forward? But I would like to bring everybody's attention to the global scenario, and that's where civil society is moving. There is a more restrictive scenario for migration everywhere. So we started seeing this in Europe a couple of years ago, migration coming from Africa, and the debates with the global compacts on migration and refugee were just a proof of that. According to civil society, we didn't move the line any further in terms of protection. Governments in Latin America, Chile, Brazil, Dominican Republic, they didn't even want to recognize those contributions to the international community. So it is really important to look at this scenario of restrictions, and with the absence, the US government historically was like a leading example of protection with several communities and procedures, and there is not that support anymore. So we need, every crisis is an opportunity, and this is the best opportunity to prove that Latin America is prepared, or the Americas as a whole, is prepared to bring solution to these problems. I mentioned before during my first presentation, UNHCR is trying to show to the world that in the Americas things work, but we are discussing here that they don't work. But we are better off than many other regions because of the language even, like there is more facilities for the language. So we should also take this opportunity to make the big step and get those structural changes into place that will be also a contribution to the world, and hopefully the US and or vice versa.
Yeah, hopefully. In terms of why no TPS for Venezuelans, well, the main obstacle, it should be no surprise, is the executive branch in this country. There's widespread bipartisan support for TPS for Venezuelans in Congress. There's been a number of various bills presented both in the House and the Senate in favor of TPS for Venezuelans. But the president doesn't even need Congress to do that. And I mean, this is a president that's rolled back TPS for Central Americans, for Haitians. In the conversations we've been having, both on the Hill and with State Department and administration figures, it seems as if the best we can hope for Venezuelans is TPS without calling it TPS. I think we may see some form of an executive order that grants TPS for or that is a stay on deportations for Venezuelans without framing it as TPS. I think it's a matter of political will and framing.
Thanks, Jeff. Other questions from the group?
I have a question over here.
And if you can just announce your name and your institution, please.
Yeah. Hi, Patricia Guadalupe with NBC Latino. I wanted to ask about that gap between the philanthropic, giving more to, Syrian refugees, for instance, than to Venezuelans, and if anything, if that anti or immigrant perception coming out of the White House has something to do with the fact that a lot of these organizations have not been able to really get beyond to reach those levels of help that some of the refugees from Latin America need, including other refugees.
I think it's a number of things. When you're comparing the situations, I think on a very visceral level.
Can you get closer to the mic?
Yeah. On a very visceral level, the Syrian kind of war and the clear mass mistreatment of Rohingya who have to leave Myanmar. I think in that sense, people, their heartstrings are maybe pulled more in the philanthropic community. I also think, though, that frankly, some of it, particularly for foundations or organizations who have focused on immigration or refugees, there's fatigue. I mean, you have 8 years of Syrian refugees and counting. You have, and all of a sudden, this massive crisis in Myanmar, and then all of a sudden, we're seeing record numbers of people at our border, and then, by the way, also like the worst migration crisis in possibly South American or even this hemisphere's history, all at the same time, all within like a 5 to 10 year period. I think that's a big part of it. So I try to see the bright side. I don't think. I mean, frankly, we're a civil society organization doing direct services, so the politics isn't something we really try to get into too much. My understanding is that the previous administration wasn't all that much better in terms of this crisis specifically. Certainly no funding that I'm aware of, and we've talked about it. This was going for 2 years, for about the second half of President Obama's term. Not to say that like anyone did anything wrong, but of course, like the anti-immigrant sentiment and the rhetoric is on a completely different level than it was now. But I don't get the sense that that has actually caused less focus on Venezuela. In fact, partly because the crisis is worse now, I think at the very least you can give some credit for whatever the ulterior motives are, which aren't necessarily good. This administration is talking about Venezuela a lot, or at least has in the past. Again, I don't think the motives are particularly good ones, but there is a conversation going where there wasn't before. So I just think it's a whole confluence of factors.
Okay, if I may just give an opinion on that. Well, there's a big gap because people are not calling things by their name. So there was a lot of fear in the Americas to call this a crisis, a humanitarian crisis by the government of Venezuela. They didn't want to accept foreign aid. And governments in the region, they didn't want to talk about refugees. So if you don't talk about refugees, you will not get the money that is available for refugees or for humanitarian aid. If you keep talking about migrants, which government receives tons of money because they receive migrants? No, on the contrary. There is some fundings, but not as there would be if people were given the protection that is needed, that is supported by international treaties for refugees and by all the infrastructure for the refugees. So in my opinion, this is just my opinion, one of the causes for that gap is governments didn't want to talk about or didn't want to name things by their name. They are not recognizing yet refugees in big numbers applying the Cartagena Declaration. So there's also difficulties to allocate the funds.
Thanks.
And maybe Paco, just to expand on that a little bit, could you explain what would happen if governments did call this crisis by its name and refer to the majority of Venezuelans as refugees? What are the additional rights or protections that would be triggered?
Yeah, thank you. So this brings us back again to why it is important to have a human rights approach. If you have a legal framework that will protect people, they will have legal security. So if the person is named a refugee, they cannot be expelled from that country. They will have some legal guarantees and they will can keep living their lives. In some of the countries that we are seeing, like Peru and Colombia, they are giving these temporary permits for 2 years. Who can plan a life in 2 years if you're going to have children in your country? And in Colombia, their children do not have access to Colombian nationality. So there are all these ramifications that if we leave all the decisions to the discretion of governments, people will still face a lot of problems in their lives. On the contrary, if you have a system that has worked for the last 70 years, that has some procedural stages and protections, people will have more legal certainty. So one of the problems is that if governments were going to recognize every individual case, it will take at least 100 years to process all the cases. And there is a legal solution in the Americas that is called the Cartagena Declaration, where there's massive violations of human rights, problems with conflicts, internal conflicts, or disruptions to the public order. Governments, and Mexico has done that in the 80s, can give a comprehensive solution, and that's what the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we have here President Alvaro Botero from the Commission, they have said that for the last 2 years, and UNHCR had to reinterpret their note, their memorandum 2 weeks ago, precisely saying this, like, it's time to do it. Like, we have asked you to do it for the last 2 years. Now there's no question that the situation in Venezuela is even worse. So if this solution was applied, it would be easier to also direct some funds. This gap, it will be interesting to see where this gap is coming from the refugee protection system.
Thank you.
And just one note before I forget. One of my points is support the local organizations, strengthen local organizations that are going to be in the country. But the point that I was leaving behind, understand what regional organizations do. That would be the case of SEGIR or WOLA. So it is important to understand what is the relationship between international organizations or regional organizations in order to work hand by hand with local organizations in order to amplify their voices and do a better advocacy. And that is exactly what the plan of action that I just talked about is about. So, of course, go for the local organizations, but at least try to understand what international organizations do. Why do I mention this? Because we were working for 10 months without any support, at least the my organization, trying to coordinate all this international effort. I have to recognize Tinker was our savior last year. So after 10 months, we didn't want to quit the fight. And there's where we find the support from Tinker, and that's where we have been trying to bring all that support for other members of the group that you just saw, and the list is growing. The list is growing, and anything that we can do in order to guide you through all these processes, monitoring and evaluation is crucial. Our next step, and we have a webpage for all these efforts, is to do a map. Who is who, what is they are doing, and where they are. So we hope that that is also helpful.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Ariella Blatter from the Wellspring Philanthropic Foundation. I grant make in the area of mass atrocity prevention. Thank you very much for this panel. A few of you spoke in different ways about the regional implications and the inherent migrant challenges and over time different solutions that have come to bear. And I got the impression that there was the desire to see a more regional approach. And I just wanted to make sure if there were particular regionally focused solutions that you were thinking of that would elevate and strengthen Venezuelan civil society as well as address cross country and migratory issues. I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, from our experience doing these dialogue tables, we are trying to do some resumes about all that the conversations with Venezuelans have having about the rights and the situation, how they are challenging all this situation in the countries hosting them. And we found some similarities in different countries. One of them is what I just talked about, this situation dealing with the emotional and the depressions. And it was something that was a contrast, because everybody talked about the identification of the permit, the regulations, and how they access to the health programs and the food programs. But the depression thing, the emotional thing, was a constant in all the discussion, and that was something that surprised us. We are doing this accumulation of documents because we have this kind of tables in 10 countries. Maybe we are finished in August, but also this feeling that from Venezuela they don't know their rights, and that's what something that was Paco telling about, is how they understand themselves as a person who has rights and how they can ask their rights in the country, and also this kind of integration in terms of job and health and food. And many of them have the feeling that there is how they are being in a temporary way in the countries and they want to go back. But with the political situation right now, many of Venezuelans are seeing this possibility to fight. And that is something because it's important to have a long-term solution for Venezuela. Because if we don't have that, it's very difficult in terms of rights to rebuild the country, to be protected in those countries who are hosting us. This is so far so good that the things that we are seeing, but when we have all the documents, we are going to share in public, and I think it would be important to see this necessity from the country, from Venezuela. And we know we are part of an international conversation, that now we are a new community from a big community in our region, and we are a big problem also, that who needs important or a coherent response. And that's why we also are doing this identification with vulnerable groups, for example, with women's rights. And something that we do, because we also work in Venezuela, is to do the documentation and the report what are the conditions that they are living in Venezuela, because the vulnerabilities and all the risks that they have in the humanitarian situation, they bring with them in the countries who host them. And all the situation about gender violence and the risks with harassment and everything is worsening in migration context. And this particular subject about the gender dimensions of the immigration is very important to address and to get attention in those countries who are hosting Venezuela.
Very quickly, the regional response. February 2017, more than 1 year ago, we appeared for the first time as a group before the Inter-American Commission, and we called for a regional response, meaning there should be a table where all the actors sit together and we have that conversation. UNHCR, IOM, governments, funders, civil society, churches. So far we haven't had that space yet, and there have been many regional responses. Grupo de Lima, Grupo de Quito, Grupo de Trabajo de la OEA, Platform, UNHCR, IOM, the Inter-American Commission, and all those institutions working on the human rights area. But we have not been able to get that regional response, and yeah, this might need like a huge conference where all the actors are sitting on the table and we finally find a regional response. But the political scenario in the Americas has divided all these responses. So Grupo de Lima is talking about some issues, Grupo de Quito other issues, and then many other groups. So yeah, we are still looking for that regional response.
The Quito Declaration that was signed in September 2018 offered a lot of us a lot of hope. It didn't really fully embrace Cartagena, which we would have liked to have seen, but it talked about what we're talking about, this set of minimum standards across the region that these 18 countries that signed committed to. It was things like accepting expired passports and other documents valid for travel purposes, broadening access to health and other essential services. But these states, the problem is they gave themselves plenty of leeway. It's access to essential services in accordance with available resources, and accepting expired travel documents in accordance with local legislation. So these commitments that sounded great at first, in the weeks and months since this declaration was issued, have kind of become much more wishy-washy. There's going to be another Quito process meeting July 4th and 5th in Buenos Aires. We were optimistic that perhaps finally we could expect something out of this meeting, but then we just found out that there's going to be another meeting after the Buenos Aires meeting in Asunción, Paraguay. So it's becoming this sort of rudderless initiative. It's becoming basically the Lima Group, but for migration. They're just a group of countries that meet regularly and talk about Venezuelan refugees with no clear commitment. So I think it's going to require some more regional initiative that's explicitly based around holding these governments' feet to the fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a direct service organization, that, like what Jeff's talking about can get very frustrating because, I can estimate in my head how much meetings like that cost and say that, like, the things we can do with that money, I can't even begin to think about it. It's just frustrating. I mean, the regional coordination is really important, but as funders, don't lose sight of what's actually happening on the ground as well. Sometimes, bigger kind of regional groups and having meetings and stuff can seem very productive, and it can be. So I'm not saying don't do that and don't look at that, but also don't at the same time forget what's happening on the ground, because for whatever the millions of dollars people are spending on meetings and flying officials, places, and security and hotels and venues, like we could literally build shelters that house 300, 400, 500 people a night and serve 5,000 meals a day. So there has to be a balance.
Well, and just also something that I have to add, with this political crisis, we have the duality of governments, because we have a legitimate government that is recognized by 54 countries, and in those 54 countries, we have a legitimate consulate, but in that consulate, we cannot renew a passport or have an identification or have a civil response for all the necessities for the Venezuelans. That is put in a worse conditions because we don't have any access to any institutionality outside the country, because the government of fact of Venezuela is controlling the SAIME and all the institutions that spy the passports and all the identification. And this is something that happened right now and affecting millions of Venezuelans outside the country.
Great. So I think we're going to wrap up the panel portion. I'm just going to ask our panelists to maybe share one more reflection, either something that you'd like to leave the funders in the room thinking about, or maybe an important point that you feel didn't get mentioned. So I think we'll just go down the panel this way and give Bibi la última palabra.
Yeah, very quickly because I spoke too much. Even if the situation in Venezuela changes today, it is estimated that 20% of the migration will come back very quickly, leaving 3 million people for the long run, almost a decade. So, solutions.
Yeah, definitely. What I would highlight is the need for focus that includes not just Latin America, but also the Caribbean. The truth is that as bad as it is in Latin America, in many countries across the Caribbean, they simply don't have asylum systems in place. And we saw this last year. Trinidad and Tobago deported around 80 asylum seekers, violating international law. So I think we shouldn't be blind to what's happening in the Caribbean.
I would pretty much repeat what Francisco said. I think we need to get to a point, I don't think we're there yet, where we acknowledge that this is going to be a 10, 20, 30-year thing. And then in a lot of cases, people will never go back to Venezuela.
Well, as you see, we have many tragedies, and to understand the situation of Venezuela is, I think, the first step to approach our situation and our crisis. And I know it's difficult to pick up what you are working on, but in the field of the human mobility crisis, I think the most important is to see all the work that civil society is doing in a regional and in a local way and support that. I think we are working to bring not just hope, but to push pressure in the governments and in international organizations that need to be coherent with the situation in Venezuela. As I said in the beginning, we are alert about what is happening too many years ago, and now is why the countries and the international organizations are reacting. We can prevent what is happening, and now we have this kind of disaster and the catastrophe what we have in my country, and we are gonna need time to rebuild the country, but we have to work in urgent and also in important, and I think this panel is asking to you to support the important. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to close with a little bit of information in terms of what are some immediate things that you can do to get involved in what is HIP doing. And before I go there, I just wanted to thank again our panelists. Thank you so much for all of the very valuable information and recommendations that you have given us. And I'm looking forward to being in touch and to continuing to this conversation with hopefully the folks who are here, folks online, and with others who couldn't be here who are very interested in understanding and continuing to begin to continue to talk about strategy. And thank you for Caroline and the Tinker Foundation for your support, for bringing us together, and for being so committed to the Venezuelan people. On a personal level, it means a lot, and I think for us who are outside of Venezuela, we're looking at a protracted situation, but there is some hope in terms of what we can do immediately right now. So on the screen you have an image that isn't moving yet, but so there's about 4 things that we're working on right now at HIP. Is one, we're going to continue funder conversations like the one we've had today, and then continue conversations that are specific to funding strategies. So bringing in some peer-to-peer learning, understanding how funders are involved in the region or are interested in being involved, and possibly doing this over a monthly, bi-monthly basis, specific to the issue of migration. HIP is also launching a crowdfunding campaign. We have the only bilingual crowdfunding site called hipgive.org, where we've provided over $2 million in funding for organizations who have launched microsites and have crowdfunded to individual donors. And so we plan to do the same for organizations that are supporting Venezuelan migrants. We encourage you to contact us. Let us know if you know organizations that should be part of our campaign, or if you are part of an organization that is doing that. We are also going to be leading the first digital giving circle for Venezuelan migrants, and so this is something that we'll be launching over the next few months. If you're interested in being part of this giving circle, learning about it, please get in touch with us. And if you want to get any updates otherwise from us, let us know. If you go to hipgive.org, hipgive.org, you can get information about our campaigns, and then learn about the work of our crowdfunding site as well. So thank you again to everyone who joined us. Thank you to all of you for being here, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with many of you in the months to come.